The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty trail as Colt Hardin crested the final ridge overlooking his homestead. 3 years of fighting Comanche raiders had weathered his face to leather and turned his brown hair nearly gray at the temples, though he was barely 32. The brass medal pinned inside his worn cavalry jacket meant little now. All that mattered was home, and the 2 women who waited for him there. The Hardin spread stretched out below him, a modest ranch carved from the harsh desert by his father's hands and expanded by his own sweat and blood. Adobe buildings clustered around the main house, corrals holding horses he recognized, and fields of corn and beans that should have been harvested by now. Everything looked familiar, yet something felt wrong. Colt urged his weary gelding down the slope, his heart quickening with anticipation. 3 years since he'd held Ayanna and Little Dove in his arms. 3 years since he'd kissed their faces and promised to return. The Apache names rolled through his mind like a prayer. Ayanna, meaning eternal blossom, and Little Dove. Barely 18 when he'd married them both according to tribal custom. They would be waiting, probably watching from the kitchen window even now. But as he approached the gate, a man stepped out from the shadows of the barn, rifle in hand. Colt didn't recognize the weathered face or the suspicious eyes that tracked his approach. "That's far enough, stranger," the guard called out. "State your business." Colt pulled up short, confusion clouding his features. "Business? This is my ranch. Friend, I'm Colt Hardin." The man's expression shifted to something between surprise and disbelief. He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt and shook his head slowly. "Now that's a mighty peculiar claim. Mr. Colt Hardin died 2 years back fighting Indians. Got the word from the army myself. You'd best move along before I call Mr. Caleb." The words hit Colt like a physical blow. Caleb, his younger brother by 4 years. The one person he'd trusted with everything he owned. "Call him then," Colt said quietly, dismounting and letting his horse's reins drop. "I'd like to speak with my brother." The guard kept his rifle trained on Colt as he hollered toward the house. "Mr. Caleb, got a situation out here." Minutes later, the front door of the adobe house swung open, and Caleb Hardin stepped onto the porch. He'd filled out in the years since Colt had seen him, his boyish face now bearing the confidence of a man who owned land. His clothes were finer than anything he'd worn before. A pressed white shirt, new boots, a silver watch chain catching the afternoon light. Caleb's face went through a series of expressions as he recognized his brother: shock, fear, and finally, a careful blankness that made Colt's stomach turn cold. "Well, I'll be," Caleb said slowly, walking down from the porch with measured steps. "Look what the desert dragged in. You've got some grit, I'll give you that. Pretending to be a dead man." "Pretending?" Colt's voice was barely above a whisper. "Caleb, it's me, your brother. I sent word through the army that I was coming home." Caleb shook his head with what might have been genuine sadness. "My brother died at Palo Duro Canyon 2 years ago, along with half his company. Got the official notice and everything. Had a proper memorial service and buried an empty coffin in the family plot." He gestured to the guard. "Tom here was at the service. Weren't you Tom?" The older man nodded grimly. "Sang hymns and everything. Your brother was a good man. God rest his soul." Colt felt the world tilting beneath his feet. "There was no battle at Palo Duro Canyon 2 years ago. I was stationed at Fort Union in New Mexico. I have papers. Papers can be forged." Caleb interrupted smoothly. "And a desperate man might try anything to claim another man's land and women." His eyes hardened. "Especially women like mine." The possessive tone in his brother's voice when he said mine made Colt's blood run cold. "Where are Ayanna and Little Dove?" "You mean my wives?" Caleb's smile was cold as winter stone. "They're where they belong, with their lawful husband. Married them proper in front of the whole town. Couldn't let them starve after my poor brother's death. Could I?" Colt's hand moved instinctively toward his gun, but Tom's rifle swung to track the movement. The rage building in Colt's chest threatened to explode, but years of military discipline held him in check. 3 against 1, in broad daylight. With innocent people nearby, it wasn't the time. "I want to see them," he said through gritted teeth. "Not happening," Caleb replied. "They're my wives now, legal and proper. You're just some drifter trying to cause trouble. Tom, escort this man off my property. If he comes back, shoot him for trespassing." As Tom gestured with his rifle toward the gate, Colt caught a glimpse of movement in the upstairs window of the main house. A flash of long black hair, a pale face pressed against the glass, and then nothing. His heart hammered against his ribs. Ayanna. She was there, and she'd seen him, but there was nothing he could do now except retreat and plan. He mounted his horse without another word, ignoring Caleb's satisfied smirk and Tom's vigilant stare, as he rode away from his own home, cast out like a stranger. One thought burned in his mind. His brother had not only stolen his land and his wives, but had convinced the whole territory that Colt Hardin was dead. That night, Colt made camp in a grove of mesquite trees a mile from the ranch, close enough to watch the house but far enough to avoid the patrols he'd spotted circling the property. As darkness fell, he saw oil lamps flickering in the windows and caught the scent of wood smoke and cooking food on the desert breeze, the smells of home, now denied to him. He built no fire, ate cold hardtack from his saddlebags, and settled in to watch and wait. Through the spyglass he'd carried through 3 years of war, he studied the routines of his stolen home. Tom and another guard took turns walking the perimeter. Caleb moved through the house like a king in his castle, and twice Colt saw him speaking with women whose shapes he knew by heart. Even at this distance, near midnight, a smaller figure emerged from the kitchen door, a woman carrying something in her arms. Even in the moonlight, Colt recognized Ayanna's graceful walk, the way she held her head. But as she moved closer to his position, hanging laundry on the line behind the house, he saw what she carried. A baby, a little girl with dark hair, perhaps 2 years old. Colt's breath caught in his throat. The child would have been born while he was fighting in New Mexico, and her features, even from this distance, looked familiar. The shape of her head, the way she moved her small hands, like his own gestures in miniature. His daughter, his and Ayanna's daughter. The rage that had been simmering in Colt's chest all day crystallized into something harder and colder than winter steel. Caleb hadn't just taken his wives as a matter of convenience. He'd claimed Colt's own child as his own, branded her with the Hardin name while her real father fought strangers' wars in a distant territory. As Ayanna finished hanging the clothes and turned back toward the house, she paused and looked directly toward the mesquite grove where Colt lay hidden. For a long moment, they stared at each other across the moonlit distance. Even at 50 yards, he could see the recognition in her posture, the way her free hand rose to her throat in the gesture he remembered from their wedding night. She knew he was alive. She knew he had come back. But she also turned and walked back into the house, carrying his daughter with her, returning to the man who had claimed them both. Colt closed his eyes and pressed his forehead against the rough bark of the mesquite tree. Tomorrow he would find a way to reach her, to learn the truth of what had happened in his absence. Tonight, he would plan and remember, and let the hatred for his brother burn slow and steady, like a forge fire that would never go out. The war against the Comanche was over. The war for his family was just beginning. The memory came to Colt unbidden as he lay beneath the star-scattered sky, watching his stolen home through the mesquite branches. 4 years ago, when the desert bloomed with rare spring rains and his father's ranch still belonged to him alone. He'd been riding fence line near the old Apache burial grounds when he heard the gunshots, sharp cracks that echoed off the canyon walls like thunder. By the time he reached the source, the massacre was nearly finished. A band of Mexican raiders had caught a small Apache family group returning from a trading expedition, and the desert sand was already dark with blood. Colt had driven off the surviving raiders with rifle fire, but the damage was done. Bodies lay scattered among overturned travois and scattered trade goods, men, women, children, and elders who would never see another sunrise. Only 2 had survived. A young Apache woman crouched protectively over a girl who couldn't have been more than 16. The older woman, Ayana, he would later learn, had taken a bullet through her left shoulder but still clutched a knife in her good hand, ready to sell her life dearly. Her eyes held the fierce defiance of a cornered wildcat, even as blood soaked her doe-skin dress. The younger girl, Little Dove, pressed herself against Ayana's back, trembling but silent. "Easy," Colt had said in the few Apache words he knew, learned from old Pedro, who worked the horses. "Friend, help." Ayana's response had been a string of Apache that needed no translation. She was telling him exactly what she thought of white men and their promises of help. But when Colt slowly removed his hat and gun belt, setting them on the ground before approaching with his hands empty, something in her posture shifted. The bullet had passed clean through Ayana's shoulder, and Little Dove had suffered only cuts and bruises. Colt helped them bury the dead according to Apache custom, a process that took 2 days and left him with a deeper understanding of their beliefs than any missionary sermon ever could. When it was finished, he offered to escort them back to their people. "No people left," Ayana had said in careful English, her first words to him in his own language. "All dead, all gone." The Apache wars had scattered the tribes like leaves in a hurricane. Some fled to Mexico, others to the reservations, and still others simply disappeared into the vast desert spaces where white men feared to follow. Ayana and Little Dove were alone in the world, 2 women with nowhere to go and no one to protect them. Colt had brought them back to the ranch, intending only to provide temporary shelter until they could find their own path. His father had been dead 2 years by then. Caleb was off in California trying to strike gold, and the loneliness of the desert had begun to weigh on Colt's soul like a physical burden. What he hadn't expected was how naturally they fit into his life. Ayana proved to have a gift for healing, both human and animal. She could set a broken bone with splints made from desert wood, brew medicines from cactus and sage that worked better than anything from the doctor in town, and coax life from the harsh desert soil in ways that amazed Colt. Her English improved quickly, and she began teaching him Apache in return, not just words, but the deeper understanding of how to read the desert's moods and seasons. Little Dove was quieter, more fragile, but possessed an artist's eye that saw beauty where others saw only desolation. She could weave baskets so perfect they held water without a single leak, and her beadwork told stories in patterns that seemed to dance with their own life. More than that, she looked at Colt with an adoration that made him feel 10 feet tall, the first person, she told him shyly, who had ever treated her as something precious rather than a burden. For 6 months, they lived as an unlikely family. Colt told himself he was simply providing protection until they could make other arrangements. But the truth was harder to admit. He had fallen in love, not just with one woman, but with both, and with the life they had built together in the desert. The Apache way was different from white custom. Ayana explained to him one evening as they watched the sunset paint the mountains red and gold. Among her people, a strong man might take more than one wife if he could provide for them, and if the women were willing. It was about survival, about creating bonds that could weather any storm. "You want us to stay?" Little Dove had asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Both of us?" Colt's answer had been to ask them to marry him according to Apache tradition, under the stars with the desert wind as witness. The ceremony was simple but profound, exchanging vows that bound them not just to each other, but to the land itself and the ancient ways that governed it. Ayana became his first wife, the keeper of wisdom and strength. Little Dove was his second, the keeper of joy and beauty. And for 2 years, they had been happy in a way that Colt had never imagined possible. The nights were the sweetest memories of all. In the privacy of their shared bedroom, Colt learned that love could be both tender and passionate, that desire could burn bright without consuming, that intimacy could exist in the space between heartbeats and in the meeting of eyes across a crowded room. Ayana taught him patience and the deep satisfaction of truly knowing another person's body and soul. Little Dove showed him playfulness and the giddy joy of discovery. They were building something precious and rare, a family that defied convention but honored something deeper than society's rules. When Ayanna told him she was carrying his child, Colt felt as though the desert itself had blessed their union. Then the army came calling. The Comanche had stepped up their raids along the frontier, and every able-bodied man was needed to defend the territory. Colt could have claimed exemption as a rancher, but the attacks were getting closer to home, and he couldn't stand by while neighbors suffered what Ayanna and Little Dove had endured. The night before he left, they held each other as if they could stop time through will alone. Ayanna's belly was just beginning to show the curve of pregnancy, and Little Dove cried quiet tears that she tried to hide. "Caleb will take care of you," Colt had promised, referring to his brother who had returned from California empty-handed and bitter. "He's family. You can trust him." How wrong he had been. Now, lying in the dirt 3 years later, Colt understood the magnitude of his mistake. He'd left 2 vulnerable women in the care of a man who had always resented Colt's success, always lived in his shadow. When word came that Colt was dead, Caleb had seen opportunity where he should have seen responsibility. The sound of approaching hoofbeats snapped Colt back to the present. 2 riders were making their way around the perimeter of the ranch. Tom and another guard Colt didn't recognize. He pressed himself deeper into the shadows and watched them pass, noting their weapons and the careful way they scanned the landscape. Caleb was taking no chances. He'd fortified the ranch like a military compound, with armed men and regular patrols. Getting close to Ayanna and Little Dove would require more than just determination. It would take planning, patience, and probably help. As the guards disappeared around the far side of the house, Colt caught another glimpse of movement in the upper window. This time, he was certain Ayanna stood silhouetted against the lamplight, and she was looking directly at his hiding place. For a heartbeat, they were connected across the distance by invisible threads of memory and longing. Then she stepped back from the window and was gone, leaving Colt alone with the desert wind and the weight of all he had lost. But not forever. He would find a way to reach them, to reclaim what was rightfully his. The war had taught him patience and strategy, and the desert had always been his ally. Caleb thought his brother was dead, but Colt Hardin was very much alive, and he was coming for his family. For 3 days, Colt watched and waited, learning the rhythm of his stolen home. The guards changed shifts at dawn and dusk. Caleb rode into town every Tuesday for supplies and business. The women, his women, appeared only briefly. Shadows glimpsed through windows or hurried figures crossing between buildings. On the 4th morning, desperation overcame caution. Colt waited until the guards were at the far end of their patrol route, then crept closer to the main house. The old storm cellar behind the kitchen had a loose board he'd never gotten around to fixing. Perhaps it would serve him now. He was halfway across the open ground when Tom's voice cracked like a whip behind him. "Hold it right there, you persistent fool!" Colt spun, hand moving toward his gun, but Tom already had his rifle trained on him. The older man's weathered face showed no mercy. "Mister, Caleb said you might try something stupid like this. Said dead men sometimes don't know when to stay buried." Tom gestured with his rifle barrel. "Now you just turn around real slow and walk away, or I'll put you in the ground permanent-like." "I just want to speak with them," Colt said quietly. 5 minutes, that's all. Ain't happening. Those ladies been through enough grief without some stranger claiming to be their dead husband, stirring up old sorrows. Tom's finger tightened on the trigger. "Last warning." Colt raised his hands and began backing away, but his eyes never left the kitchen window where he'd glimpsed a flash of doe-skin dress. As he reached the tree line, Tom's voice followed him. "Next time I see you, I shoot first and ask questions after." The rifle butt that cracked against Colt's skull came from behind, delivered by the second guard he'd failed to notice. Stars exploded across his vision as he pitched forward into the dirt, tasting blood and hearing Tom's satisfied chuckle. "Should have listened, stranger. Now you get to learn the hard way." They dragged him beyond the property line and left him bleeding in the desert sun with a warning that the next visit would be his last. By the time Colt regained his senses fully, the sun was setting and his head felt like it had been split with an axe. He made his way deeper into the hills, following half-remembered trails from his boyhood exploration of the desert. His father had taught him to read the land like a book, to find water in the driest places and shelter in the most exposed terrain. Those skills, honed by 3 years of military campaigns, would have to keep him alive now. The canyon he sought lay hidden behind a jumble of red sandstone that looked impassable to casual eyes. But Colt remembered the narrow gap between towering walls, the secret passage that opened into a hidden valley his Apache friends had shown him years ago. If anyone still lived there, they might help him, or at least not shoot him on sight. The old Apache camp was mostly empty now, just a few weathered wickiups and cold fire rings. But smoke rose from one dwelling, and as Colt approached, a familiar figure emerged from the shadows. Nyan, Old Wolf in the Apache tongue, had been ancient when Colt first met him, and the years had carved deeper lines into his mahogany face. But his black eyes were still sharp as obsidian, and the rifle in his gnarled hands was steady as stone. "White man comes bleeding to the sacred places," Nyan said in accented English. "Why should Old Wolf not send you to join your ancestors?" "Because you taught me the desert's secrets once," Colt replied in careful Apache, using the words Ayanna had drilled into him. "Because I married daughters of your people and loved them as my own blood." The old man's expression didn't change, but the rifle lowered slightly. "Colt Hardin died fighting the Blue Coats' war. The white brother told us so. Showed us the paper with army words. Caleb lied." Colt touched the still bleeding cut on his scalp. "I'm alive, and I've come home to find my wife stolen and my child claimed by another man." Nyan studied him for a long moment, then gestured toward his wickiup. "Come, Old Wolf will tend your wounds and hear your words. Then we decide if you speak truth or wind." The interior of the dwelling was dim and smoky, filled with the scents of sage and sweet grass. Nyan cleaned Colt's wound with practiced efficiency, muttering in Apache as he worked. When he finished, he sat back on his heels and fixed Colt with that penetrating stare. "Your white brother came 3 seasons ago with paper saying you died. Brought soldiers to prove his words, Ayanna and Little Dove. They mourned like proper wives, cut their hair, wore ashes, sang the death songs." The old man's voice carried the weight of witnessed sorrow. "Then the white brother said he would care for them, marry them so they would not starve. Said it was white man's law." Colt's hands clenched into fists. He used their grief against them, made them believe they had no choice. Ayanna fought him at first. Proud woman, strong medicine. But Little Dove was heavy with child, your child, and winter was coming. The white brother had food, shelter, protection from those who hate Apache blood. Nyan's eyes grew distant. "Sometimes survival costs more than death." The words hit Colt like physical blows. Little Dove had been pregnant when he left, and he'd missed the birth of his daughter entirely. While he'd been fighting strangers' wars, his wives had been forced into an impossible choice: marry his brother or watch their child starve. "What kind of man has he become?" Colt asked hoarsely. Nyan's face darkened. "The kind who smiles with white teeth and strikes with a closed fist. Ayanna bears marks sometimes, bruises that speak of angry hands. Little Dove has grown thin and silent, like a bird with clipped wings." The old man leaned forward. "He keeps them like prizes, not wives, shows them to town people as proof of his Christian charity to savage women." Rage bloomed in Colt's chest, hot and clean as desert lightning. "I have to get them out of there. White brother has many men with guns now. Makes the ranch like a fort. Tells everyone he fears Apache raiders might come for the women." Nyan's smile held no warmth. "He fears the right thing, but the wrong enemy." "Will you help me?" The old man was quiet for so long that Colt wondered if he'd fallen asleep. Finally. Nyan reached into a parfleche bag and withdrew a small object, a piece of turquoise carved into the shape of a wolf, worn smooth by countless fingers. "Ayanna gave this to Old Wolf when she thought you dead, said to keep it safe for the daughter who would never know her father." He placed the carving in Colt's palm. "But if father comes back from the dead, maybe daughter should have her grandfather's gift after all." Colt stared at the carving. his throat tight with emotion. Ayanna had kept faith with Apache tradition even in her grief, ensuring their child would have a connection to her heritage. The white brother rides to town tomorrow. Nyan continued. Takes only 2 men, leaves others to guard the women, but there is a place where the canyon trail narrows, where one man might speak to another without guns between them. You mean for me to face him alone? Face him, yes, but not alone. The old man's eyes glittered in the firelight. Desert has many ears, many eyes. Some still remember when Colt Hardin showed respect to Apache ways, treated sacred burial grounds with honor. Nyan stood with the fluid grace of a much younger man. Old Wolf knows paths through the hills that white men never see, knows how to be shadow when shadow is needed, as if summoned by his words. Other figures began emerging from the darkness beyond the fire's reach. Apache men Colt recognized from his courtship days. Weathered faces marked by loss, but not broken by it. They had stayed in the hidden places while their tribes scattered, keeping the old ways alive in secret. You would do this for me? Colt asked, humbled by their presence. Not for you, replied one of the men, Joseph, Ayanna's cousin. For Ayanna, who tends our sick when the white medicine fails. For Little Dove, who weaves baskets for our ceremonies. For the child who carries Apache blood but grows up thinking she is white man's daughter. They spoke long into the night, planning and preparing, when dawn broke over the desert. Colt felt something he hadn't experienced since his return. Hope. He was no longer alone against his brother's forces. The desert itself had taken his side, and the ancient spirits of the land would guide his steps. But first, he needed to reach Ayanna, to let her know he was alive and had come for her. Tomorrow, when Caleb rode to town, Colt would make his move. The reunion he'd dreamed of for 3 years was finally within reach. The question that haunted him as he settled down to rest was whether she would still want him after all they'd both endured, or if too much had changed to ever make things right again. The moon hung like a silver coin above the canyon walls when Ayanna finally came to him. Colt had been waiting in the hidden grove for 2 hours. Following the message, Nyan had somehow managed to slip to her, a small piece of bark with symbols that meant moonrise, sacred spring, alone. She appeared like a ghost between the mesquite trees, moving with the silent grace he remembered so well. But when the moonlight touched her face, Colt's heart nearly broke. The proud, strong woman he'd married was still there, but worn thin by years of suffering. Her cheekbones stood out sharp beneath skin that had lost its healthy glow, and her eyes, those beautiful dark eyes that had once danced with laughter, now held shadows deep as canyon walls. Ayanna, he whispered, rising from where he'd been crouched among the rocks. She stopped 10 feet away, her whole body trembling like a deer poised for flight. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other across the moonlit space. 3 years of separation stretching between them like an unbridgeable chasm. You are dead, she said finally, her voice barely audible. I sang the death songs. I cut my hair. I mourned you proper. I'm alive, Colt said softly, taking a careful step toward her. I never died. Ayanna, I came back as soon as I could. No! She shook her head violently, backing away. Dead men don't come back. Caleb showed me the papers. The army said... Caleb lied. The words came out harsher than he intended, and she flinched as if he'd struck her. Colt forced his voice to gentle. He told everyone I was dead so he could take everything. The ranch, you, Little Dove, everything that was mine. Ayanna's composure cracked like ice in spring thaw. A sob escaped her throat, then another, and suddenly she was weeping with the force of a flash flood. 3 years of buried grief pouring out in the desert night. Colt closed the distance between them and caught her as she collapsed, pulling her against his chest where she fit like she'd never left. I waited, she gasped between sobs. I waited so long for word from you. Letters stopped coming, then nothing, then Caleb with his papers and his sad face, saying you were gone. Her fists beat weakly against his shirt. Why didn't you write? Why didn't you tell me you were alive? I did write, every week for 3 years. Colt's own voice was thick with emotion. Caleb must have intercepted the letters. Oh God, Ayanna, what did he do to you? She pulled back to look at his face, her fingers tracing the new lines around his eyes, the gray in his hair, the scar on his jaw from a Comanche lance. You're older, she whispered. Harder. So are you. He touched the hollow of her cheek, the place where dimples used to appear when she smiled. What happened to your joy, my beautiful one? Where is the woman who used to laugh at my terrible Apache pronunciation? Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. She died when her husband died. When she had to marry another man to keep her daughter from starving. The bitterness in her voice cut him like a blade. Caleb said it was temporary, just until spring came. Said he was doing Christian duty. Then he said the law required proper ceremony. White man's ceremony. Then he said, she couldn't finish. Colt's hands clenched into fists. He forced you. Not at first. At first he was kind, patient. Said he understood my grief, that I could have time to adjust. Ayanna's voice grew flat, distant. But after the wedding, kindness became expectation, patience became demands. When I refused to share his bed, he reminded me that wives have duties, when I still refused. She touched her ribs unconsciously, and Colt saw the ghost of old bruises in the gesture. White-hot rage filled Colt's vision. His brother, the boy he'd protected from schoolyard bullies, the man he'd trusted with his most precious treasures, had used violence to claim what was never his. I'll kill him, he growled. No. Ayanna's hand pressed against his chest. He keeps Mary close always. Our daughter, she is his weapon against me. When I fight, she suffers. When I refuse him, she goes hungry. Her voice broke. I learned to submit to protect her. Mary. Their daughter's name was Mary, probably chosen by Caleb to erase any trace of her Apache heritage. Tell me about her, Colt said softly. Our little girl. For the first time since she'd appeared, a ghost of Ayanna's old smile touched her lips. She has your stubborn chin, your way of tilting her head when she thinks, but Apache eyes, Apache spirit. The smile faded, though Caleb tries to beat the savage out of her, says she must learn to be a proper white child. The image of his brother raising a hand to Colt's daughter sent fresh waves of fury through him, but he forced himself to focus on the woman in his arms. And, little dove, how is she? Ayanna's face closed off completely. Little dove is changed. The first year, she fought like me, refused Caleb, spoke of you, kept Apache ways in secret. She pulled away from Colt's embrace, wrapping her arms around herself. But she was always the gentle one, the one who saw beauty where others saw hardness. The fighting broke something in her spirit. Now she does what Caleb wants without question, speaks only when spoken to. She is like a shadow of herself. Does she know I'm alive? I don't know. Nyan's message came only to me. Ayanna looked up at him with desperate eyes. She may not believe it, or she may not care. The woman you married? I think she is gone forever. They stood in silence for a moment, absorbing the weight of all that had been lost. Then Ayanna stepped back into his arms, pressing her face against his throat like she was trying to memorize his scent. I dreamed of this, she whispered. Dreamed you would come back and save us. But dreams and daylight are different things. Even if you are alive, how can we escape? Caleb has guards, guns, friends in town who believe his story. And Mary, her voice caught. I cannot leave without Mary. We'll find a way, Colt promised, his lips brushing her hair. I have help, Nyan and some of the old warriors. We can get you and Mary and Little Dove away from here. Somewhere Caleb will never find you. Where? There is nowhere Apache can go that white law doesn't follow. And you, if Caleb proves you're alive, you'll be branded a deserter or worse. He's had 3 years to build his lies. Colt pulled back to meet her eyes. Then we'll go to Mexico, or deeper into the territories where the law doesn't reach. I don't care where, as long as we're together. Together, she repeated wonderingly, as if the word was foreign. Then her expression crumpled. I'm not the woman you married anymore. Colt, what Caleb did to me, what I allowed him to do. I'm broken, soiled. You might not want me if you knew. Stop! He cupped her face in his hands, forcing her to look at him. You are the woman I married. You are the mother of my child. You are the strongest person I know, and nothing that was done to you changes that. Nothing. She searched his face in the moonlight, looking for signs of deception or disgust. When she found only love and fierce protectiveness, fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. I love you, she whispered. I never stopped loving you, even when I thought you were dead, even when I had to pretend to be another man's wife. I love you too, he said. And then they were kissing with desperate hunger, trying to bridge 3 years of separation with touch and taste and the familiar dance of tongues. She tasted of tears and sorrow, but also of the wild desert herbs she'd always favored, and beneath it all, the essential essence that was purely Ayanna. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. I have to go, she said reluctantly. If Caleb wakes and finds me gone, meet me tomorrow night, same place. It's dangerous. He's been watching me more closely since you appeared. And if Mary cries in the night and I'm not there. She shook her head. I'll try, but I cannot promise. Then I'll wait every night until you can come. He pressed the turquoise wolf carving into her hand. Nayan said this was meant for Mary. Ayanna's breath caught as she recognized her grandfather's gift. You found Nayan. He still lives. He's been waiting to help us. We're not alone in this. My heart. She clutched the carving to her chest, and for a moment, looked like the fierce, hopeful woman he'd married. Tomorrow night, if I can. But Colt, be careful. Caleb is not the boy you remember. He's become something cruel, something that enjoys causing pain. If he discovers you're alive, he won't, not until I'm ready for him to know. She kissed him one more time, soft and lingering, then melted back into the shadows like she'd never been there at all. Colt remained in the grove long after she disappeared, his heart full of both joy and anguish. Ayanna still loved him. Their daughter was alive, and hope, that rarest of desert blooms, had taken root in his chest. But the price of 3 years was written in the lines around his wife's eyes, and the thought of what Caleb had done to both his wives in Colt's name made his hands shake with the effort not to ride to the ranch immediately and put a bullet in his brother's skull. Tomorrow night couldn't come fast enough. The discovery came at dawn, 3 days after their moonlit reunion. Caleb's roar of fury echoed across the ranch yard like the bellow of an enraged bull, sending chickens scattering and horses shying in their corrals. Where have you been sneaking off to, you lying witch? From his hidden vantage point in the hills. Colt watched through his spyglass as his brother dragged Ayanna out of the main house by her hair. Even at this distance, he could see the finger-shaped bruises on her throat, the way she held herself as if every movement caused pain. Caleb had found the evidence he'd been looking for. Grass stains on her dress that didn't match anything near the ranch, the scent of sage that grew only in the high canyons, and, perhaps most damning of all, the glow in her eyes that hadn't been there since her supposed husband's death. I asked you a question? Caleb's voice cracked like a whip as he shook her. You've been meeting someone, haven't you? Some man you've been spreading your legs for while I'm working to keep food on your table. Ayanna's response was too quiet for Colt to hear, but her posture, straight-backed, defiant despite her injuries, told him she wasn't breaking. Not yet. Little Dove appeared in the doorway, drawn by the commotion, carrying Mary in her arms. The sight of his daughter, so much bigger than when he'd glimpsed her that first night, made Colt's heart clench. She was beautiful, with Ayanna's delicate features but his own stubborn jawline, and her eyes held an intelligence that reminded him painfully of his lost brother's childhood. But those same eyes were wide with fear now, and she pressed her small face against Little Dove's shoulder as her supposed father raged at the woman she thought was her aunt. Maybe you need a reminder of your place, Caleb snarled, raising his hand. The blow never fell. Little Dove's voice, barely audible but carrying clearly in the desert air, stopped him mid-swing. Please, Caleb, not in front of Mary. Caleb whirled on his second wife, his face twisted with suspicion. You know something about this, don't you, you little dove? Your sister-wife has been acting strange, and you've been watching her with those secretive eyes of yours." Little Dove shifted Mary to one hip and stepped protectively between Caleb and Ayanna. The gesture was small, but it spoke of courage Colt hadn't seen from her in the glimpses he'd caught of their stolen life. "I know nothing," she said simply. "Ayanna grieves still. Sometimes grief makes people walk in the night, seeking peace they cannot find in daylight." Caleb studied her face with the cold calculation of a snake deciding whether to strike. "Grief," he repeated mockingly. "For a man 3 years dead, if she's grieving, maybe I should give her something fresh to mourn." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a wildfire. Colt's finger tightened on his rifle trigger, every instinct screaming at him to put a bullet in his brother's skull. Only the knowledge that Mary would see her father, the only father she'd ever known, die before her eyes stayed his hand, instead of violence. Caleb chose humiliation. He grabbed Ayanna's chin and forced her to meet his gaze. "Strip," he commanded loudly enough for the ranch hands to hear. "Right here, right now. If you've got nothing to hide, you won't mind showing everyone what belongs to me." "No." Ayanna's voice was barely a whisper, but it carried absolute refusal. The backhanded blow sent her sprawling in the dirt. Mary began to cry, and Little Dove clutched her closer, her own face pale with fear and helpless rage. "I said strip," Caleb roared. "You're my wife, bought and paid for, and I'll display my property however I choose." Tom and the other ranch hands had gathered at the sound of the commotion, their faces showing various degrees of discomfort with their boss's behavior. But none moved to intervene. Caleb paid their wages, and a man's treatment of his wives was considered his own business in this hard country. Ayanna pushed herself to her knees, spitting blood from her split lip. "I am not your wife," she said clearly, each word carrying like a gunshot in the morning stillness. "I never was your wife. You are nothing but a thief who steals from the dead." The words hit Caleb like physical blows. His face went white, then red, then white again as rage and fear warred in his expression. "What did you say?" "You heard me." Ayanna stood slowly, facing him with all the dignity of an Apache warrior preparing to die in battle. "You are a liar and a coward who hides behind dead men's names." Caleb's hand moved to his gun, and for a terrifying moment, Colt thought his brother might actually shoot an unarmed woman in front of witnesses. Instead, he gestured sharply to Tom and another man. "Lock her in the old grain shed. No food, no water, until she learns some respect." His voice had gone deadly quiet, which was somehow more frightening than his earlier shouting. "And if anyone tries to help her, they'll join her." As the men moved to obey, Caleb turned his attention to Little Dove, who was still holding the weeping child. "As for you, my dear wife, I think it's time we had a private conversation about loyalty." The implication in his tone made Colt's stomach turn to ice. He watched helplessly as his daughter was torn from Little Dove's arms by one of the ranch hands, her small voice calling pitifully for Mama Rose, the name she'd apparently given Little Dove. "Take the child to Mrs. Patterson in town," Caleb ordered. "Tell her there's been some trouble at the ranch, and we need her to watch Mary for a few days." "No!" Little Dove's composure finally cracked. "Please, she's just a baby. Don't punish her for—" The blow to her stomach doubled her over. Gasping, Caleb grabbed a handful of her dark hair and jerked her head back to meet his eyes. "The child will be fine with Mrs. Patterson. It's you I'm concerned about right now." His smile was cold as winter stone. "We're going to have a long talk about truth and consequences. You and I, about what happens to wives who forget their place." Colt had seen enough. As Caleb dragged Little Dove toward the house and the ranch hands dispersed to carry out their orders, he slithered backward from his vantage point and began making his way toward the hidden valley where Nyan waited. The old Apache took one look at Colt's face and reached for his weapons without a word. "They have Ayanna locked up," Colt said without preamble. "No food, no water, and Caleb is—" He couldn't finish the sentence, but Nyan's expression showed he understood. "Little Dove? He's hurting her, right now, while we sit here talking." Colt's voice was raw with fury and helplessness. "And they've taken Mary to town, away from both of them." Nayan studied the younger man's face, reading the barely controlled violence there. "You want to ride down there with guns blazing, like cavalry charge?" "Yes, that will get them killed. And you too." The old Apache's voice was calm, but his eyes burned with their own anger. "White brother is not stupid. He knows someone is helping Ayanna, knows she did not find courage and defiance on her own. He is setting trap. Then what do you suggest? Let him torture them while we plan." "No!" Nayan stood and began gathering his weapons. An old Spencer rifle, a cavalry saber with Apache symbols carved into the hilt, and a knife that looked older than the desert itself. "We save them tonight, but we do it smart, like Apache, not like angry white man." As the old warrior outlined his plan, Colt felt a cold clarity settle over him. The time for stealth and patience had passed. Tonight, one way or another, his family would be free, or they would all die together. The war for his wives and daughter was about to begin in earnest, and Colt Hardin had no intention of losing again. The grain shed sat like a tombstone in the moonless night, its adobe walls radiating the day's heat back into the desert air. Colt pressed himself against the rough surface, listening for any sound from within. Nothing but silence, a silence that terrified him more than screaming would have. It had taken 3 hours to reach this point. 3 hours of crawling through arroyos and using every shadow, every fold in the ground, every trick Nayan had taught him about moving unseen. The old Apache and 2 younger warriors, Joseph and Samuel, had taken positions around the ranch's perimeter, ready to create diversions when needed. The lock on the shed door was new, heavy iron that would take too long to break quietly. But Colt remembered building this structure with his father 20 years ago, remembered the loose adobe brick near the foundation that had never been properly mortared. His fingers found it in the darkness, worked it free with agonizing slowness to avoid any sound. The gap was barely wide enough for his shoulders, but desperation gave him strength. He squeezed through, tearing his shirt on the rough edges, and found himself in pitch blackness that smelled of grain dust and human suffering. "Ayanna?" he whispered, so quietly the word was more breath than sound. A rustling in the far corner. Then her voice, cracked and hoarse. "Colt, is it really you? Or am I dying and seeing spirits?" He found her by touch, his hands mapping the damage Caleb's cruelty had inflicted. She was sitting propped against the wall, and when his fingers brushed her face, they came away wet with blood from her swollen lips. Her dress was torn, her wrists raw from the ropes that had bound her before they'd locked her away. "How long since they gave you water?" he asked, uncapping his canteen and guiding it to her lips. "Don't know. Sun was high when they put me here." She drank greedily, water spilling down her chin. "Is it night now?" "Past midnight. Can you walk?" "I can crawl to freedom if needed." Despite her condition, he heard an echo of her old fire. "But little Dove, Caleb took her into the house hours ago. I heard her crying, then nothing since sunset." Colt's jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. "I'll get her, both of you, but first we need to get you out of here." He helped her through the gap in the wall, supporting her weight when her legs nearly buckled. The fresh air seemed to revive her somewhat, and she managed to walk the 50 yards to where they'd hidden his horse, though she leaned heavily on his arm. "There's an old mining cave about a mile north," he whispered. "Nayan's waiting there with supplies. Can you make it that far if I tie you to the saddle?" "I can make it to California if it means freedom." She gripped his arm with surprising strength. "But don't leave little Dove with him. Whatever he's done to me, it's worse for her. She's breaking. Colt has been for months. One more night might destroy what's left of her spirit." Colt settled her on his horse and secured the reins in her hands. "Ride straight north until you hit the old mine road. Then follow it uphill. Nayan will be watching for you." He pressed his spare pistol into her free hand. "If anyone follows you, anyone at all, you shoot first and ask questions later." "What about you?" I'm going to get Little Dove and settle accounts with my brother. No. Ayana's voice was sharp with fear. It's a trap. Colt, he knows someone helped me survive out there in the desert, knows I didn't find courage on my own. He's waiting for you. Then he'll get what he's waiting for. She caught his hand as he started to turn away. Promise me something. If it goes wrong, if they kill you, promise you'll take me with you. I won't live as Caleb's prisoner again. The moonlight caught the fierce determination in her battered face, and Colt saw the warrior woman he'd fallen in love with still burning bright beneath the surface. It won't come to that. Promise me. I promise. But it won't be necessary. He kissed her forehead gently. Now go. Every minute we waste gives him more time to hurt her. He watched until horse and rider disappeared into the night, then turned his attention back to the house where his brother held Little Dove prisoner. The building stood dark except for one window on the second floor, Caleb's bedroom, where a single candle flickered like a malevolent eye. Getting inside would be harder than reaching the grain shed. The house was built like a fortress, with thick walls and few windows. Most of them barred against Apache raids that never came, but Colt had helped design those defenses, and he knew their weaknesses. The old servants' entrance on the east side had a door that swelled in desert humidity, leaving a gap at the bottom big enough for a determined man to work his fingers under. The lock was internal, but the gap allowed him to slide his knife blade up and work the latch free with patience born of desperation. The hinges creaked once, a sound that seemed loud as thunder in the stillness, but no alarm was raised. Colt slipped inside and found himself in the kitchen where he'd shared countless meals with Ayana and Little Dove in happier times. Everything looked the same yet felt alien. Familiar furniture arranged by a stranger's hand. Familiar rooms that no longer welcomed him. This had been his home, his sanctuary, and Caleb had turned it into a prison. He made his way through the dining room and toward the main staircase, every floorboard a potential betrayal. The house creaked and settled around him like a living thing, and twice he froze at sounds that might have been footsteps. On the second floor, candlelight leaked from beneath Caleb's door, but no voices came from within. Either Little Dove was unconscious, or... Colt refused to complete that thought. She would be alive. She had to be. The doorknob turned silently under his hand. Caleb's arrogance had led him to leave it unlocked. Colt eased the door open just enough to peer inside, and what he saw nearly made him rush in shooting. Little Dove lay on the big bed that had once belonged to Colt's parents, her wrists tied to the headboard with strips of cloth that had probably been torn from her own dress. She was conscious but staring at the ceiling with empty eyes that held no hope, no fight, no recognition of the world around her. Caleb sat in a chair beside the bed, fully clothed but disheveled, a bottle of whiskey in one hand and his gun in the other. He was talking in a low, conversational tone that was somehow more disturbing than shouting would have been. "Thought you could help her plot against me," he was saying. "Thought you could play the innocent while your sister-wife made a fool of me. But I know better now. I know you're all the same underneath, scheming, lying, ungrateful." Little Dove didn't respond, didn't even blink. The strong silent type now. "Are we?" Caleb took a long pull from the bottle. "That's fine. I prefer my women quiet anyway. Less complaining, less backtalk." He set the whiskey aside and leaned forward. "You want to know a secret? Little Dove, your precious first husband, the great Colt Hardin, he's not as dead as everyone thinks." That got a reaction. Little Dove's head turned slightly, and for the first time her eyes focused on Caleb's face. "Oh, yes," Caleb continued with evident satisfaction. "He's out there somewhere, playing ghost, trying to steal back what's mine, but he's too late. You see, much too late." His voice dropped to a whisper. "Because even if he kills me, even if he rescues you both, you'll never be the same. I've broken you both in ways that can't be fixed. You're wrong." The words were barely audible, but they came from Little Dove's lips. Caleb blinked in surprise. Apparently, he hadn't heard her speak in weeks. "What did you say?" "You're wrong," she repeated, stronger now. You haven't broken us. You've only shown us who you really are. A small, cruel man who takes pleasure in others' pain because he has no strength of his own. Caleb's face flushed red with rage. He stood abruptly, the gun wavering in his unsteady hand. Shut up. Shut your lying mouth. He is alive. Little Dove continued, and now her voice carried something Colt recognized, the quiet strength that had first drawn him to her. I can feel it in my bones, and he's coming for us. He's coming to die. Caleb snarled. And you're going to watch it happen before I finish what I started with you. No, said a new voice from the doorway. She's not. Caleb spun around, and the gun in his hand swung toward Colt's chest. For a frozen moment, the two brothers faced each other across the bedroom where they'd played as children, where Colt had comforted Caleb through nightmares, where they'd planned their futures and sworn they'd always stand together. Hello, Caleb, Colt said quietly. We need to talk. The silence stretched between the brothers like a taut wire, each man measuring the other across 3 years of betrayal and bitter change. Caleb's gun never wavered from Colt's chest, but his hands shook with whiskey and shock. You're supposed to be dead, Caleb whispered, his voice cracking like a boy's. I saw the papers. The army confirmed it. Papers you forged. Soldiers you bribed. Colt kept his own hands visible, away from his weapons. One wrong move and Little Dove would be caught in crossfire. How much did it cost to buy yourself a dead brother, Caleb? I didn't. This isn't. Caleb's composure crumbled like sun-dried adobe. You don't understand what it was like. 3 years of waiting, 3 years of taking care of your responsibilities while you played soldier? Taking care of my responsibilities? Colt's voice was deadly quiet. Is that what you call raping my wives and terrorizing my daughter? The word rape hit Caleb like a physical blow. His face went white, then flushed red with defensive anger. They're my wives now, legal and proper. I saved them from starvation, gave them a home, made them respectable. By beating them into submission? By forcing them into your bed with threats against Mary? Colt took a careful step into the room. That's not salvation, little brother. That's slavery with a marriage certificate. Don't call me little brother. Caleb's gun hand steadied as rage overtook fear. I'm not the boy who used to hide behind you anymore. I'm the man who owns this ranch, who built something real while you chased glory in someone else's war. You built it on lies and theft. Another step. Tell me something, Caleb. When you first heard I was dead, were you sad, even for a moment? Or were you already planning how to claim everything I left behind? The question struck home. Caleb's eyes flickered with something that might have been shame before hardening into cold justification. You think you're so much better than me. You married 2 Apache women and thought that made you some kind of saint? The whole territory laughed at you. Colt called you a savage lover, a disgrace to the white race. And you? What did you call me? I defended you. Caleb's voice cracked with old hurt. Even when the neighbors whispered, even when the church folk turned their backs, I stood up for my brother's choices. And how was I repaid? You rode off to war and left me to clean up the mess. What mess? A thriving ranch? 2 women who loved me? A life I'd built with my own hands? A life that made us pariahs? Caleb was fully shouting now, spittle flying from his lips. Do you know what it was like being Colt Hardin's brother? The man who married squaws? I couldn't court a decent woman, couldn't do business with half the territory. Colt felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. His brother's bitter letters from California, the failed mining ventures, the return home empty-handed and full of resentment. So, when I died, you saw your chance. Marry my wives to legitimize the situation, claim my land, become the respectable Hardin brother at last. It wasn't like that, but the protest was weak, unconvincing even to Caleb himself. From the bed. Little Dove's voice cut through their argument like a knife blade. Yes, it was. You told us the first night, said we could be proper Christian wives now, saved from heathen ways. Said our children would grow up white instead of half-breed bastards. Caleb whirled toward her, his face twisted with ugly fury. Shut your mouth, you... No! Little Dove's voice grew stronger, fed by years of suppressed rage. "I've been silent long enough. You want to know what you really are? Caleb Hardin, you're a coward who couldn't win a woman honestly. So you stole two from a dead man. You're a weakling who beats defenseless women to feel strong. The backhand blow snapped her head sideways, but she didn't cry out. Instead, she turned back to face him with blood on her lips and fire in her eyes. "You're nothing," she finished quietly. "Nothing but a shadow of the man whose life you stole." Caleb raised his hand again, but Colt's voice stopped him cold. "Touch her again and I'll kill you where you stand." The brothers locked eyes across the room, and for a moment, Caleb seemed to remember who he was facing. Colt had always been the stronger one, the faster gun, the natural leader, even drunk and holding a weapon. Some part of Caleb still feared his older brother, but fear and liquor made dangerous companions. "You'll kill me?" Caleb laughed, high and brittle. "With what? Your famous reputation? Your righteousness?" He swung the gun toward Little Dove's head. "One move and I paint the wall with her brains." "And then what?" Colt remained perfectly still, but his voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. "You think I'll let you live after that? You think you can murder my wife and walk away? She's not your wife anymore. None of them are." Caleb's composure was fragmenting like glass under pressure. "They're mine. This ranch is mine. Everything you had is mine now." "Even my daughter?" The question hit like a thunderclap. Caleb's face went slack with shock, and the gun wavered in his grip. "That's right." Colt continued relentlessly. "Mary isn't your child, is she? She's mine and Ayana's. Born while I was fighting your war, raised thinking her father abandoned her." His voice broke slightly. "How many times did you tell her about her dead daddy? How many nights did she cry for a man she'd never met while her real father fought strangers in a foreign desert? Stop!" The word was barely a whisper. "She has my eyes, doesn't she? My stubborn chin. Did you ever look at her and wonder if she'd grow up to hate the man who stole her real father's name?" "Stop!" Caleb screamed, but his grip on the gun was loosening as emotional pain overwhelmed physical control. It was the opening Colt had been waiting for. He lunged forward, not toward his brother, but toward the bed, putting himself between Little Dove and the weapon. Caleb's shot went wild, punching a hole in the wall where Colt's head had been a heartbeat before. They went down in a tangle of limbs and fury. 3 years of betrayal exploding into violence. Caleb was drunk and unsteady, but desperation gave him strength. They rolled across the floor, fighting for control of the gun. Old reflexes from childhood wrestling matches mixing with deadly adult intent. "I loved you," Colt gasped as his brother's elbow caught him in the ribs. "You were all the family I had left. And I hated you," Caleb snarled back, his fingers clawing at Colt's eyes. "Perfect, Colt. Everyone's favorite. Even our father loved you more." The admission hung between them for a split second before they crashed into the washstand, sending pitcher and basin flying in a cascade of broken pottery. Colt got his hands on the gun barrel, but Caleb held the grip, and neither could break the other's hold. "You want to know the truth?" Caleb panted as they struggled. "I was glad when the army said you were dead. Finally, I could be the important brother. And look what you became." Colt managed to get his knee into Caleb's stomach, doubling him over. "A rapist. A child beater. Everything our father would have despised. The mention of their father was a mistake." Caleb's face went purple with rage, and he found strength from somewhere deep in his poisoned heart. The gun turned in their joined hands, pointing now at Colt's chest. For a frozen moment, they stared at each other over the weapon. Then Caleb's finger tightened on the trigger. The shot was muffled by their close proximity, but the sound still seemed to fill the room like thunder. Little Dove cried out from the bed, and smoke drifted between the two men as they remained locked together. Then Caleb's grip loosened, and he looked down at the spreading red stain on his shirt with something like surprise. "I didn't mean," he whispered, his voice suddenly young and confused. "I didn't want it to be like this." "I know," Colt said softly, easing his brother down to the floor. "I know." Caleb. Blood bubbled from Caleb's lips as he tried to speak. The girl, Mary. She's really yours? Yes. She's beautiful, smart, stubborn like you. Caleb's eyes were growing glassy. I never hurt her, never laid a hand on her. Whatever else, I never hurt the child. It was perhaps the only mercy in 3 years of cruelty, and Colt felt tears burning his eyes. Thank you for that. Tell her. Caleb's voice was fading. Tell her Uncle Caleb wasn't always bad. Tell her he tried to be good. The words trailed off into silence, and Caleb Hardin, beloved brother, bitter rival, destroyer of lives, went still against the floor where they'd played with toy soldiers as children. Colt knelt there for a long moment, one hand on his brother's cooling forehead, feeling the weight of all their shared years pressing down on his shoulders. Then Little Dove's voice called him back to the present. Colt, please, the ropes! He moved to free her, his hands shaking as he worked the knots loose. When her wrists were free, she sat up and wrapped her arms around him, both of them holding tight to something real and alive in a room that suddenly felt full of ghosts. Is it over? She whispered against his shoulder. It's over, he promised. We're free. But even as he said the words, Colt wondered if any of them would ever truly be free from the scars this night had left behind. 6 months later. The mountains of New Mexico Territory rose like ancient guardians around a small valley where smoke drifted lazily from a modest adobe dwelling. The house was simple, 3 rooms and a covered porch where strings of corn and chilies hung drying in the autumn sun. But it was home in a way the grand Arizona ranch had never been. Colt sat on a wooden chair he'd built with his own hands, watching his daughter play with a group of Apache children near the creek that ran through the valley. Mary, though she'd begun asking to be called by her Apache name, Shema, meaning my mother's daughter, had adapted to their new life with the resilience of childhood. At 3 years old, she was learning both languages with equal facility, switching between English and Apache as naturally as breathing. The bullet wound in his chest had healed to a puckered scar, but some mornings he still felt the echo of that night in Caleb's bedroom. The physical pain was nothing compared to the weight of killing his own brother, even in self-defense. Some burdens, he'd learned, never fully lifted. They just became part of the landscape of a man's soul. She looks happy, Ayanna said, settling beside him with a cup of coffee brewed strong and black the way he liked it. Her own recovery had been slower. The damage Caleb had inflicted went deeper than bruises and broken ribs. But each day brought small victories, moments when her laughter rang out clear and genuine, when her eyes held joy instead of shadows. She looks free, Colt corrected, watching Mary attempt to copy the older children's intricate finger games. No one's telling her she has to choose between being Apache or white. She can just be herself. They'd been accepted into this small community gradually, cautiously. The Apache here were remnants of scattered bands who'd found refuge in these hidden valleys, away from the reservations and the army patrols. Nyan's word had carried weight, and the story of Colt's marriage to Apache women, his genuine respect for their ways rather than mere conquest, had opened doors that might otherwise have remained closed. The territorial authorities had investigated Caleb's death, of course, but the evidence had been clear enough. The gunshot wound, the signs of struggle, the testimony of ranch hands who'd witnessed Caleb's increasingly erratic behavior. Self-defense during a family dispute over property rights. The fact that Colt was legally dead had complicated matters, but a good lawyer in Santa Fe had sorted through the paperwork. Colt Hardin was officially alive again, and the ranch in Arizona had reverted to him by right of law. He'd sold it within a month, wanting nothing more to do with the place where so much pain had been born. The money would keep them comfortable for years, maybe decades, if they lived simply. I've been thinking about Little Dove, Ayanna said quietly, her fingers tracing patterns on the wooden arm of her chair. It's been 3 weeks since she left. No word, no sign. The departure had come without warning one morning in early September. They'd woken to find Little Dove's few possessions gone and a note written in her careful English. I need to find who I am without the shadow of what was done to me. Don't follow. Don't worry. I will be well. Colt had wanted to track her, to make sure she was safe, but Ayanna had convinced him to respect Little Dove's choice. She needs to heal in her own way, his wife had said. Some wounds require solitude to mend. Still, he worried. Little Dove had been the gentlest of them, the most damaged by Caleb's cruelty. The thought of her wandering alone through a world that showed little mercy to Apache women made his chest tight with anxiety. She'll come back when she's ready, he said, though he wasn't sure he believed it. Or she'll find a new path, a better one than anything we could offer her here. I pray to the old spirits that you're right. Ayanna leaned against his shoulder, and he felt some of the tension leave her body. Physical affection still came hard to her sometimes. Unexpected touches could send her into flashbacks of Caleb's violence. But each day brought small steps toward healing. Their own relationship was rebuilding slowly, like a house reconstructed brick by careful brick. The passion was still there, burning beneath the surface, but it was tempered now by deeper currents of understanding and patience. They'd both been changed by their ordeal, scarred in ways that would never fully heal. But perhaps that was simply the price of surviving something that should have destroyed them. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew their attention to the valley entrance, where a lone rider was making his way down the winding trail. Colt's hand moved instinctively toward his gun. Old habits died hard, but he relaxed as he recognized Joseph, Ayanna's cousin, who served as an informal messenger between the scattered Apache communities. News from the outside world, Joseph called as he dismounted near their porch. Thought you should hear it from family rather than strangers. Colt and Ayanna exchanged glances. News from the outside world was rarely good for people like them. What is it? Ayanna asked. Joseph accepted the cup of coffee she offered and took a long drink before speaking. Armies pulled back from the southern territories. Too much trouble with bandits and revolutionaries down Mexico way. They're consolidating forces closer to the big towns. That was good news. Less army presence meant fewer questions about Apache movements, fewer patrols to avoid. And, Joseph continued, there's word of a woman traveling the old trading routes. Apache woman, alone, healing sick people and animals with medicine knowledge. Some say she's a spirit, a ghost of the old times come back to help the scattered peoples. Ayanna's breath caught. Little Dove? Could be. Description fits. Young, beautiful, skilled with herbs and song medicine. Never stays in one place long. Never asks for payment. Joseph smiled. If it's her, she's found her path. The spirits are guiding her steps. They talked long into the evening, sharing news and stories, remembering better times and planning for uncertain futures, when Joseph finally departed, promising to return within the month. Colt and Ayanna sat together on their porch watching the stars emerge in the desert sky. Do you ever regret it? Ayanna asked quietly. Giving up the ranch, the comfortable life, coming to live like outcasts in the wilderness. Colt considered the question seriously. The ranch had represented security, respectability, a place in the world of white society. Here, they lived on the margins, dependent on the goodwill of people most Americans considered savages. Their daughter would grow up knowing she didn't quite belong in either world, Apache or white. But when he looked at Mary playing freely with her new friends, when he saw the gradual return of light to Ayanna's eyes, when he woke each morning beside the woman he loved without fear of what the day might bring, the answer was easy. Never, he said simply. This is where we belong. This is home. Ayanna smiled, and for the first time since his return, it reached all the way to her eyes. Home, she repeated, as if testing the word on her tongue. Yes, I think it is. Later that night, as they lay together in their simple bed listening to the desert wind sing through the canyon walls, Colt whispered the words that had become their evening ritual. This time, I promise, I will never leave you again. I know, Ayanna whispered back, her hand finding his in the darkness. We have found our way back to each other, and nothing will separate us now. Outside their window, Mary slept peacefully in her small bed. dreaming perhaps of the adventures tomorrow might bring. And somewhere out there in the vast wilderness, a woman who had once been called Little Dove walked her own path toward healing, carrying medicine and hope to those who needed it most. The war was over. The healing had begun. And in a small valley in New Mexico territory, love had proven stronger than betrayal, forgiveness more powerful than revenge, and family, chosen rather than born into, had triumphed over all the forces that had tried to tear it apart. The desert wind carried their story across the starlit landscape, adding another chapter to the endless tales of those who found home not in grand houses or respectable society, but in the simple truth that sometimes love is the only law that matters. Thank you for listening to this Wild West love story of survival, betrayal, and redemption under the desert stars. I'd love to hear from our campfire audience. Where are you listening to this tale tonight? Are you by your own fireside? Or perhaps under an open sky like Colt and Ayanna? Please subscribe to Wild West Campfire for more stories from the frontier and share your thoughts about love, forgiveness, and finding home in the most unexpected places. Until we meet again around the campfire, may your trails be safe and your hearts be full.